Welcome, everyone. I see people still coming in, but we are going to be starting because some of our speakers are on a tight schedule, so we don't want to be running late. Welcome, everyone, to this plenary session, How Data Impacts Lives Towards a Zero Patients Vision by 2030. My name is Anu Partanen. I think most of you, if you were here yesterday, have probably already seen me up on stage, but I am a moderator for several events here. My background is in journalism, and I've written about healthcare, so that's my connection to this event. Today in this plenary session, we will have a keynote speech, and then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards, and then we'll have a Q&A, so feel free to then comment and ask any questions that you might have. But first, I'd like to invite to the stage Mrs. Liisa-Maria Voipiopulkki, and she will bring greetings from the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs in Finland. Ms. Voipiopulkki is the Director General of Strategic Affairs and Chief Medical Officer at the Finnish Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Finnish Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, and on behalf of the Minister Krista Kiuru, it's my great pleasure and honor to wish you all welcome to Finland and to this fascinating EHMA 2019 event, Health Management 2.0. At this point, I would like to thank the organizers and all the Finnish hosting institutions for putting together such an interesting and up-to-date program, which I believe will give much food for thought for us all, irrespective of our various backgrounds and roles in the health systems in Europe and beyond. In the program booklet, we read the following. Over the next 10 years, we need to focus globally on very specific key challenges to ensure that our health systems, and I read here, people, will benefit from innovation at scale. Digital health portability, biologistics, and live learning. And further, however, the postcode is still one of the greatest predictors of health outcomes, and health systems are under incredible financial pressure. Well, having said so, the obvious question, at least to me, is how health can or should be managed, and after all, whose business is it? Is it a public health issue? A health in all policies, government, society, you name it, issue? Or what is the role of medical expertise in health management? Not to say a word of the role of individuals and people themselves. Or keeping the SDGs in mind, is health actually increasingly a societal issue with global aspects such as climate change or global health security? Well, in this country, health and the health system has made headlines as a political issue. The Finnish people largely share the principles and values of our Nordic welfare model created together over the years as a joint effort. The cornerstones of this model are non-discrimination, equality, tax-funded health, well-being and education services, high social mobility, and an active civil society. In many respects, the Finnish municipality-based health and social care system has performed extremely well. However, the combination of rapid demographic change, highly variable municipality size, and the fiscal difficulties has called for more uniform governance models and better cost containment on the national level. The need for a health and social system reform has been under debate in Finland for more than a decade. The generally accepted aim of the reform from a health systems point of view has been to reduce the inequalities in people's well-being and health and improve equal access to high-quality services that cater for people's needs and deliver value. The health and social services reform is again included in the agenda of our recently established coalition government. The key element of the reform is to transfer the responsibility for organizing the services to 18 self-governing regions, we call them counties, that are much larger than the municipalities on average used to be. Even before the necessary legislation to get this reform through, there will be the launching of a development program to refresh the primary health and social services center concept to be again on the driving seat of the system. The purpose of the development program, to be initiated more or less immediately, is to strengthen people's trust in the public healthcare and social welfare services supported by private providers when appropriate. For example, the maximum waiting times for access to non-urgent primary healthcare will be remarkably shortened, and digital services further developed, keeping in mind especially access to care, health promotion, prevention, and people who need integrated services or have specific communication needs. Promoting society-wide digitalization is actually one of the main themes of the government's program. It also promotes the already quite extensive collaboration that we have had across the ministries and with other stakeholders to enhance the data-intensive research and development ecosystem in the health and social services sector. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday our main newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, published an editorial on digitalization, and I quote, "Public services have an important role in promoting digitalization in a country like Finland. As a well-functioning administration speeds up societal development, whereas ineffective public services slow them down. Effective administration is one of Finland's traditional strengths. In the era of digital public services, Finland is now the highest scoring EU member state, which has been mentioned here already yesterday. While Finland is on the top countries in the Union measured by the number of ICT specialists and especially the gender balance of professionals in this field, work remains to be done in improving the digital skills of the entire nation." End of quote. Finland's EU Council presidency will begin in 2 weeks from now. The main theme of the social and health sector will be the economy of well-being. Taking people's well-being into account in all policies is of key importance for the economic growth, productivity, as well as for the fiscal and societal stability, and vice versa. So we are here talking of a holistic approach which increases our understanding of how, for example, promoting mental health, occupational health and safety, gender equality, and individual or personalized care, if you so wish, have a vast potential to reduce public expenditure in the long term and increase productivity and economic stability. The economics of well-being is also at the heart of Agenda 2030 and promotes achieving sustainable development goals. This horizontal approach is increasingly important in the coming years due to the challenges we face in financing the health systems as aging and changes in the work life go further. Well, promotion of health and well-being, as well as prevention of diseases and social exclusion, are of major importance in reducing future public expenditure and prolonging working life. Today, only 3% of the health budget of the EU are used for prevention and 97% for treatment. The cost of scaling up effective preventive interventions is low compared to the costs that are likely to result if preventive measures are not taken seriously. To achieve the best possible benefit, promotion of health and well-being should actually be targeted, especially to those groups most in need, and by using innovative methods, not the methods of yesterday. At the same time, we are witnessing the beginning of a new era in healthcare, the era of personalized medicine. Powerful tools have become available for the development of treatments that address the causes rather than merely the symptoms of disease. The new technologies enable us to identify more accurately people at risk of developing disease and patients who are most likely to benefit from treatment. We believe that this new era of data-intensive technology and AI will also provide broad possibilities to enhance people's functional capacity and, for example, to enable the elderly to live at their homes longer. People will also be empowered to foster their own health more than ever before. For decades, Finland has developed its legislation to support digitalization of the health and social welfare services, beginning with the Client Data Act and the Act on Electronic Prescriptions, continued by the Biobank Act, and culminating in the Act on Secondary Use of Health and Social Data already this year, and the Genome Center Act that is currently being prepared and is actually under public consultation right now. This is another facet of the economy of well-being. We believe that it will bring major opportunities and benefits for research and innovation sectors, startups, and PPP cooperation, as the vast health and social databases will be safely and securely used to develop products and services for the benefit of our peoples. This is also how the Finnish government wishes to fully utilize the potential of the digital era, which is already here. We just have to jump on board, paying full respect to the sensitive nature of the personal information and the individual's right to be forgotten if he or she so wishes. With these thoughts, I once again wish you all warm-heartedly welcome to Finland, and I hope that you will go back home with some fresh ideas, peer support, and come back next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liisa-Maria. And so now we will move on to our keynote speech, and I think this was a perfect introduction to that as well, since it all ties very well together. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Elias Stupka, and he's the Senior Vice President and General Manager at Life Sciences Business at Health Catalyst, which is a healthcare analytics company based in Boston. And Dr. Stupka in the past has led data science at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and he started his career as a member of the first team that annotated the human genome in Cambridge, UK, and since then he has worked in various roles in areas of digital health, genome research, and the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you very much, Elia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So I'll be talking to you about how data impacts lives towards a zero patients vision by 2030. Obviously, a sort of provocatory title. What I will try to talk to you about is how possible it would be in 10 years' time to have close to zero patients and all patients diagnosed early and treated, etc., but how unlikely it is given all the challenges that we would have to solve. So that's sort of the premise to my talk. So let me start from a picture of Boston. This is the river between Boston and Cambridge. This is where I have been based for the last few years. When you live in a place like Boston, and I'm sure many of you have been there for professional reasons, you're sort of surrounded by this whirlwind of innovation, startups, Harvard, MIT, all the different institutes, all the different companies, large and small, that are operating there. And so it's easy to sort of start believing that that's how the planet looks, right? So that the average person has access to all that technology, all that know-how, all that capital, and all that innovation. Unfortunately, we know that's not the case. But it also affords you a particular lens in a way, in the sense that very often, especially if you're part of sort of advisory boards or boards of various organizations there, you sort of have a little lens to the future. You see I don't know, a clinical trial being designed for Alzheimer, probably several years before any press release will be made about the results of that trial. You see a new nanotechnology device, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of start believing that, there is a possible future where all this innovation will really transform healthcare. But before we go to 2030, I just want to go back a little bit to 99, actually, and kind of give you a very brief sort of personal history of how I came, into this space of health. So 99, just for those of you who, I think many of you, unfortunately, many of us in this room remember 99. So it's when, the Matrix movie came out, just as a reminder, or Beverly Hills, or et cetera, et cetera. I was actually in Cambridge, UK, and I was working on the human genome at the time. I was very lucky to be part of the first team in Hingston that really worked on the public project for the human genome, which, as some of you might remember, kind of ramped up very substantially when Craig Venter decided to privatize, a company called Celera and try to privatize the human genome. A really interesting sort of time in history of how actually a private company really pushed the public to step up. So Clinton and Blair, agreed to ramp up, and the Wellcome Trust to ramp up the funding. So very privileged to be part of the team, to look at the first data. Also a lot of firsts in history. The first time we built a data center and what now is commonly accepted to be supercomputing, high performance computing, for a project for public good. One of the problems is that, of course, this project finished with a nice handshake of Clinton and Blair, everybody happy that the genome was sequenced, but also a lot of promises, a lot of expectations of what we would get out of something like the human genome. And there's a picture from a few years later when we were trying to understand gene expression and building all these heat maps. And it's really to represent that really for many years, we didn't extract anything from the human genome that had impact on patients or human life. We were just trying to start understanding complexity. We were just trying to figure out what had we just uncovered and how can you make sense of it. So much so that exactly 10 years later, so in 2009, I was sitting with this journalist from The Economist who published a big issue on the crisis of human genetics. Very interesting. Basically was saying Wellcome Trust and many other organizations have spent so much money in human genetics. They have created all these genetic studies, but really has it had any change? Has it had any impact on people's health? Has it changed anything for the average citizen in the street? And the truth was it hadn't, right? And that's why this article had been brought together. And one of the reasons is that really we really had to go a lot deeper into the data to understand cause and effect. So to really start unraveling, okay, what is it within all this new wave of biomedical data that can help us to understand cause and effect, and therefore then create treatments, etc. And indeed, actually, quite ironically and paradoxically, just after this Economist article, a couple of years after that, I was at San Raffaele Hospital in Milan, where we built some of the first successful gene therapy trials, the first EMA-approved trial for immunodeficiencies for bubble kids. So this was, working with a team that had started 20, 30 years ago, understanding the very basis of the immune system, and all the way to creating a gene therapy, delivering it, using genomic sequences to test safety, and getting it approved, and then GSK in-licensed it. Then Orchard Therapeutics now is developing dozens of these types of therapies. But it's sort of ironic how just a few years before we were complaining what a failure the human genome had been, and then we were actually just starting to come up with some of the first successful uses of all that information. And that's basically to say it takes a long time. It takes a lot of investment, a lot of time to move from understanding something to being able to act on it. In recent years, before I was at Health Catalyst, I worked at Dana-Farber, and I think now we're sort of 20 years in. And what we see at a place like Dana-Farber is, we had about 900 trials going on at any one time. The standard of care does not really exist at Dana-Farber because the majority of children at Boston Children's Dana-Farber are on a trial. They're not on standard of care. Even for adults, the standard of care is probably about 55% of the patients are on something that you would call standard of care. So again, the sort of apotheosis of innovation But there again, you're in a place where you're lucky, you're very, very lucky to be a patient there because you'll be exposed to the latest pathways, the latest trials, cancer vaccines, you name it, pretty much all of the, I think Dana-Farber contributed to about 50% or 55% of FDA-approved drugs in the world, so, in cancer. So, you're in a very unique place, but again, it doesn't represent the rest of the world. So one of the things we started thinking about at Dana-Farber was, how do we create a bridge? And one of the ways was, for example, building industrial partnerships to take the Dana-Farber pathways and really figure out how can we digitize these and how can we make sure that the hospital in a completely different part of the world can actually take some of this knowledge at a very live, up-to-date level through software and be able, with software and of course, human support to apply a Dana-Farber standard of care, quote unquote, to their hospital, which I think is one of the most important challenges that we have today. Going back now to the present, we're faced with, I think, yesterday in our introductory to the plenary, we were saying how we're faced with very expensive therapies, very sophisticated therapies, so you don't have the money or the skills to even implement them, from genetic engineering to cell therapy. We all know about digital health, sensors, devices. It's sort of overwhelming how much innovation is happening. So I don't think we have an innovation problem. I don't think we have a problem anymore that to be worried that we will not have the cure or the treatment or the device or the technology. Everything revolves around everything else. How do we implement them? How do we create health systems that can actually function and absorb all of the upcoming innovation that is coming? And the hardest part is that your postcode, your zip code is US slide, so 90210 is the Beverly Hills zip code, but your postcode everywhere in the world, within your city, as well as at the country level, still impacts the most, basically, your outcomes in health. And if we don't solve this, we can have all the innovation in the world. We're not going to actually make the planet improve in healthcare by any means. If anything, we'll keep pushing these divides and these boundaries. So, having said what the problem is, I think from a solution perspective, first of all, and this is probably the hardest part, the solutions have to be global. If we launch the best possible, most digitized, most forward-looking, most progressive policy for our own little region or country or hospital, we're not really going to solve healthcare challenges, right? Most of the systems are too small to benefit from some of the greatest developments that are happening. If you think of rare diseases, it's a perfect example of how, unless we think globally, we will have a biotech in wherever it is in the world, in Boston or somewhere else, that is thinking about developing a treatment for a disease, and when they go to their investors, the investors say, well, it's only 222 children in America, so we cannot develop this drug. But if you look at that globally, you would have much more patient reach, but you need to be able to reach and find those patients. So it has to be global. I also think we will have a very major problem in what I like to kind of biologistics, and as a joke, and it is a joke, you can think of it as Amazon Health. So just like Amazon has made it very easy to ship packages, we cannot keep developing CAR T therapies, cancer vaccines, incredibly sophisticated approaches to therapy that require an army of biologists and chemists and materials engineers and et cetera, to cure 5 or 10 or 15 patients, right? So we will have to find ways to take all of this sophistication and turn it into something hopefully much more scalable, simpler, and cheaper, because otherwise we will again, and we've seen it, I think, with Juno Therapeutics and all the CAR T companies, their market projections were huge because their clinical benefit, especially in the beginning, if you ignore some of the toxicity, looked great. And then the market projections started going down because of all the complexities. You need to create competence centers. You need to be able to, deliver all of this. The other challenge that I think we will need to solve is true full digital portability. So again, as a joke analogy, you can think of it as a Dropbox for health. So, as easy as it is for all of us in this room, it doesn't matter which country we live in, is to put a file on Dropbox, send a link, and it's fine. We cannot do that yet between two hospitals, forget about doing it between two countries, forget about doing it between two continents. And yet, the ability to transfer information about patients could really dramatically save lives, right? Whether it's a patient that has no hope locally because of whatever particular situation they might be in. And there is somebody, we have companies that are paying very dear fees to find a single patient for a trial, and yet they keep going to the same 10, 20 hospitals in the world, right? They'll go to New York, to Boston, they'll go to London, they'll go to some of the biggest centers, and there's, the other 90% of patients is never reached by those trials. And then some form of live learning, and here, the analogy is with Tesla, because the Tesla cars are learning from each other. We have to be very careful because you don't want to over-promise, how artificial this is. It's a lot of human learning, but we need a process by which it doesn't take 5 years or 10 years. If somebody has run a study in one country and has achieved a good outcome, for that sort of best practice to quickly translate digitally somewhere else, right? We cannot have a conference like this for every learning that we have to make because change is happening so rapidly. And so we're going, when it comes to what I mentioned in terms of biologistics, we're basically going from something like pills, which are relatively easy to ship around the world, to all of these things, right? AAV vectors, CAR Ts, cancer vaccines. These are things that really have a level of sophistication that, unless it's simplified and made cheaper and more scalable, will hit a lot of roadblocks in terms of being able to be delivered. And of course, they stay very expensive, which even in a richer country is becoming a huge problem. And I mentioned digital portability, so the ability to really have the connectedness of information and of need, right? Of demand of a patient that requires help, and that for whatever logistical, financial, scientific or other reason cannot get help in that place, but where somebody else might even pay for that patient to be treated as long as they know that they exist and that they are treatable and reachable. So we need to solve those things. So about a year ago, I moved to Health Catalyst, and one of the things, I'm sort of like a child in a toy store now, because we work with more than 500 hospitals and 5,000 clinics, and we're able, therefore, to look at data and look at population health and outcomes across the largest data set I have personally ever worked with. So it's about 50 trillion data points. It's more than 120 million patients. And this really enables us to start driving change, right? To really look at patterns, at populations at a very large scale, and to get, informed data to make changes and to help those changes at the hospitals that we work with. I want to stress, because there's so much hype around data and artificial intelligence. We take it for granted. We have machine learning models, we have data, we have AI. But it's not a big part of what we do. It's probably like maybe 10%, 20%, because what we really need to do to make change is we think of AI as augmented intelligence, which means, yes, there is some artificial component that helps you to build a model, to build a predictive model, but then unless you understand how that gets deployed in the human environment and how humans interact with it, you could be making the worst possible changes, right? So a model could look great artificially, and then you bring it into the hospital and you don't realize that if you deploy it at 9 a.m. versus 3 p.m., it will be completely different, or that in one department it might work and in another one it might not. So you need to really create an adoption strategy for what data is telling you. So we really, when we think about AI, we really think about starting from the leadership, culture, and governance level. If what you're trying to change and transform is not aligned to the financial incentives and people incentives of the organization, it's never going to work. Of course, we're fortunate in that we work often with organizations that are switching from fee-for-service to value-based. So, by moving to value-based or helping them to move to value-based, we can, find ways to help them do that. And really then say, what are the best practices? Use a lot of data, not sort of stale and old articles, but use the data from that hospital and say, okay, what is the data saying? Where are there opportunities to improve and transform? And then look at, impacting an outcome, and then measuring if that outcome is really sustained. So if we kind of take our hands off is the outcome still there? Has that change really remained and has it sustained? And for us, at least, as an organization, we also pay our employees according to this. So our bonuses and all the compensation structure and our board goals are aligned to the outcome improvement, and we measure outcomes, and that's our key performance goal, because that makes us aligned with who we work with. So I wanted to take an example because I think it's kind of a really nice example of how a potential possible future would go. I'm showing a picture of headphones because we recently started working with a startup called MedRhythms, which has digitized music therapy for stroke survivors. So this is something some of you might have already seen, not in a digital way, but in a normal delivery, clinical delivery system. How music rhythm can help stroke survivors improve their walking, their gait, et cetera, and they have digitized it. What I find beautiful about this example is if you think about it, there's no language barrier. It can be delivered through headphones and a little motion sensor on the patient's feet. So it kind of summarizes my talk in the sense that on the one hand, we could do this for millions of people tomorrow, right? We all have headphones, we all listen to music. Now across rich and poor, you will find mobile phones and music being listened to through headphones pretty much everywhere. And so it could be delivered. There is no language barrier. It's digital and it could be administered. Whether we do it or not really depends on all the things that I've been talking about. Can you break the political, legal, technological barriers to make that happen, overnight? I mean, we all signed up to companies like Facebook or Airbnb or whatever, and we are all sharing pictures of our breakfast, but we still can't save a child's life if they have a rare disease, right? That's a paradox that we've created with technology. So, to finish on a note that, how could this work in a possible future if you break these barriers? You would have a mother in one country with a child that is affected by a very particular disease that can't get help locally, but all of the information, all of the diagnostic information would be globally available, and there would be some company somewhere that was actually looking for a patient like this because they were developing a new therapy. The treatment would be engineered and produced locally and delivered to the door of the child. And you could shorten what normally would be 5-10 years of R&D, commercialization, expansion across countries, et cetera, for somebody like that to be treated. And most importantly, because of the learning aspects, somebody else, some other child that's somewhere else would then the next day, the next week, the next month benefit from the results of the clinical study with the first child. So this is sort of the hope that I have, but I think, also relating to these 3 days we're spending together, a lot of it will depend on whether we are able to start breaking those barriers and really creating that sort of connectedness between systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elia. Please take a seat. I'd like to invite now our panel up on stage. So we have Mr. Alessandro Lorenzo. He's the president of the Portuguese Association of Hospital Managers. Dr. Usman Khan, who's the executive director of the European Patients Forum. And Dr. Natasha Zopardi-Muscat, who's president of the European Public Health Association. Please take seats. Go ahead, I'll grab the seat that's left so you can choose. So I thought we'd start with each panelist briefly reflecting on some thoughts that Elias' talk gave you, and then we could do another round where everybody would give some suggestions for solutions or next steps in solving some of these issues. Natasha?
Thank you, Anu. Well, I mean, I'd like to say that even though we had already had conversations earlier, the way you put it all together, I found really resonated with my vision of how I'd like to see things panning out. I think one of the most important things you said is about people. for me, one of the reasons why we don't get the progress that we would like as fast as we do is that we don't put people first and technology second. And I think you highlighted that. A couple of points which perhaps I would be intrigued in discussing more would be around really being able to better target healthcare interventions. So from a public health perspective, for example, we do screening, we do a lot of preventive, secondary prevention, where we sort of treat the whole population in the same way. And given that everybody is trying to save on resources, reduce waste, to what extent will these technologies be able to allow us to really target better our interventions? And then perhaps also you alluded to the concept of frugal innovation, which I think is really important also if we want to go global with these kind of innovations. I'll stop there because I know that time is limited.
Yeah, already excellent points that Natasha's made. And Elia, again, what I really liked about that presentation was the tempered optimism. And I think we need that approach. And I think the two things that I would pick out is, one is the risk of exacerbating health inequalities. And we know that. As you said, you know, what's available to someone at a cancer medical center in Boston is not available in so many other areas of the world. And yet the potential that's there to be able to offer these services on a global basis. So I think that global orientation and not reducing health inequalities is something that I pick up on. And then the second one is around governance. And you talked about the necessity for governance to not allow developments to move ahead of where governance is at. And I think what I'd be interested to know is, where have you seen instances where governance is keeping up? We know that there's liberal democracy is having a particularly troublesome time at the moment. And yet if you look below government to governance, you can see some really interesting examples of how you can provide a governance structure. I'd be interested to know what ones you might pick up on.
Elia, would you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can briefly respond. I want to make sure the panelists have time. But I think, I see, I guess, two realities. One is within the US, you basically have mini countries, right, in the sense that every private large health system basically has its own governance structure. And we certainly see, amongst, let's say we have about 70 or 80 clients in terms of like legal entities that we work with. We have about a dozen that we call our flywheel customers. So these are customers where the governance has kicked in together between us and them, where there is a positive flywheel, right? So where you really go through the whole process of, first of all, understanding that change is hard, right? And so it's not going to happen overnight. It's not a quick win. And you have to figure out the internal governance and alignment, compensation. So we try to align, with the quality measures, with everything that drives their incentives. Because if you don't drive those, you cannot then look at the data and really be truthful about what the data is telling you and where the opportunities are. Then start operating on those, recognizing it takes time, people, energy, investment. Then you start seeing the results, and those feed into the next wave. And that's what we mean by a sort of flywheel. So that's sort of, to me, as in terms of our health systems, kind of a positive example. I think if you look sort of global in terms of governments and how they're implementing their governance, we see some really interesting progress in places like Singapore, for example. And in general, I think in some of the Asian countries, Thailand has gone through a deep transformation. We were just training, people at the Ministry of Health in Singapore in the last couple of weeks, and there is a real, I think, willingness to, again, listen to the data, see what the data is saying, and start operating in a data-driven manner, but then understanding it takes people and effort and investment to change culture and transform.
Alexander.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, congratulations for the nice talk. I also agree with the optimistic view, but I think you also need to raise the issue is that actually we are not able to deal with most of the diseases that are there forever. So we are talking about treating everyone, or at least finding the cure for every diseases, but you still face in Europe, for example, most of infectious diseases that we are not able to control, even though we have the technology for doing it. So, for example, for tuberculosis or for HIV or hepatitis, actually we have the technology at least to treat the patients, but we are not achieving it. So actually we live in the world where actually we have the technology, but health systems don't know how to apply it. And I think actually it's up to us, all of us in this room, to find the gaps and to work on them, to apply this technology correctly. Because at some point, and the risk that we have is to increase inequalities. We live in an increasing inequality world, and healthcare is continuously moving also, I think, in that direction. And actually, the inverse care law makes more and more sense in the current world. And if you see, for example, the example of Boston, or the example of Stockholm, or the example of Kosovo that is in Europe, we see completely different realities. In Kosovo hospital, we only have free drugs for cancer patients. Free drugs for cancer patients. It's Europe. It's not Africa, it's not Southern Asia, it's Europe. And we continue to live with this, we continue to accept it, and actually our role as healthcare managers and healthcare thinkers is how are we going to deal with it, how are we going to apply this technology in order to achieve universal health coverage.
So what do you think are the main obstacles that even in Europe we have
Mostly is, first of all, we continue and we have a driving force that is selling us healthcare as a commodity. At some point, and we need to be quite careful of it. We need to of course, we live in a market society, but we need to be quite careful when we try to sell healthcare as a commodity. And I think probably the public health idea that is mostly striking, and I think that we need to engage, is to achieve universal health coverage. And in that sense, we need to start it with low-cost technology, and we need to apply it. It doesn't make sense to pay for 200,000 euros for CAR T cells for a treatment where we cannot provide treatment for a tuberculosis patient. So that's the issue, is start to do it, to have an increased number of people vaccinated, to try to treat vulnerable populations, and that's in our power.
Thank you. So that brings us nicely to our second question. What would be next steps and solutions? Perhaps we could start if you, Natasha, would like to comment on your thoughts.
Thank you. I think in Europe, perhaps on a positive note, for example, the development of the European reference networks is a good example that should, in theory, 10 years down the line, really be able to answer your question, at least for all over Europe. Who are my children with this rare disease, and how can I reach out to all of them? And I think that's all good, it's commendable, it's going in the right direction. The question is that in healthcare, if we're only going to really go for those very small, articulate, literate populations, and most parents of children with a rare disease do end up becoming that kind of group of people, we're going to be leaving the bulk of burden of disease behind. And I think we need to find ways in which we can try to make this technology more attractive, more accessible to those people who really need it. And one very practical example, I would say, for example, would be, say, mental health in young people, because young people are going already to be more likely to be innovative and to take up something that is new. Again, it's an issue that is cross-cutting across all of society. And I think we need a couple of these really big wins, so to say, so that something doesn't just remain, you know. Even with digital health, sometimes we attend conferences and people are still whinging about the need to scale up. We don't want to lose this kind of huge potential by just continuing to deal with pockets and not really try to identify uses that will have a huge impact on a large proportion of the population. Because I think increasingly with the kind of politics that we are seeing, unless we can get people to push for something, we won't get the political governance to make it happen. So I think that would be my proposal for the next steps for the industry, for us, but also to be able to push Europe to see the political importance of also engaging with health systems at European level, something which far too often is a little bit on the agenda and at risk of falling off the agenda.
Osman.
Yes, I mean, and it's great that we have that practical solution focus, because I think there really is a risk that we either don't make maximum benefit of the opportunities, or the opportunities exacerbate health inequalities. And it's about that, being able to sort of keep pace. So I would point to an initiative that the European Patients Forum is involved with, which is Data Saves Lives. And Data Saves Lives is a campaign that originated in the UK, in Manchester, and is now has a sort of global footprint. And that notion to be able to say, yes, data can save lives. And I think it's that's why I think it's stayed, because it's quite compelling. But we've working with Deepak Kalra at the European Institute for Health Data on a project which is part funded by FPIA, which is trying to create a health data community, a safe space for people to ask even the simplest questions like, what is the human genome? If mine is sequenced, will it be accessible to pharmaceutical companies, or will it be accessible to research organizations? I think people have some pretty simple questions that they need answering, and then they need some way to be able to get agile governance systems that are able to keep pace but respond and allow it on both an individual level in terms of the privacy and in terms of our first speaker being able to make that permission to withhold data as well as to be able to give data, but also on a population level. And we need the governance on the individual level, and we need the governance on the population level.
I would actually like to bring us back to data. We had a little bit of a discussion earlier, and so there's many angles, of course, to data, but one is what you were talking about of sharing data between different systems, between different countries, finding patients. But of course, then we have the privacy questions, and we have different types of privacy laws. Could you elaborate a little bit, and maybe the panelists could also comment from different perspectives? You were saying that in the United States, actually, it is in some ways easier because there the data privacy laws are not so strict, so you can have access to data, which is great for researchers, but of course, patients often are very wary of that and worried about what happens to our data.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with the premise that, wherever I worked, whether it was in a pharmaceutical company in Europe, whether it was in the US, one of the biggest problems we often have with data legislation is the fear factor, right? So the specific organizations, data officers or ethics officers, etc., just sort of veering on the side of safety and fear, and not looking at that upside potential of data saves lives. Because I remember even in Germany, when you would actually sit down and say, well, this is how we're going to do this is how the patients can consent, etc., then you would come to a yes. But it would take 2 years of discussions to explain that actually what you want to do was both legal and ethical and hopefully, helpful for the patients. So I would start just in general that's, I think, a common issue that we have. Certainly in the US, the HIPAA regulation basically draws a pretty kind of strong line between identified, PHI identified information and how that is handled versus de-identified aggregated data. And when it's de-identified and aggregated, it's basically very liberal, right? So data is sold and purchased. We don't actually, just because of our kind of mission and approach, we don't actually sell data, even though we're always approached for it because we have a lot of data. But legally speaking, it can be sold and exchanged and purchased, etc., because it's non-re-identifiable. And that, of course, from an innovation perspective, fuels an incredible powerhouse of innovation. Every startup, every company, every not-for-profit, every university can basically tap into these very large resources. Like Aetna gives its entire data set to Harvard Medical School, and they can just go and publish and do, whatever they feel like doing. So, so from that perspective, I think it helps. The other thing I would say is, again, to show both sides of the coin. There's also a tendency sometimes nowadays to also overvalue data. So there are, both not-for-profits and for-profit organizations that tend to say, oh, your data, your individual data is incredibly valuable. These companies are making incredible amounts of money from your data, while the reality is that the data is valuable in large aggregates, and the single individual information is actually not that that valuable. So that's another myth. Some blockchain companies, some new startups are trying to kind of also almost go the other extreme and say, we'll empower you and your data will be yours, and it's almost as if it had this incredible value, while the reality is that you need populations to infer results. So those are sort of the two observations. Of course, the very kind of fine-grained GDPR related aspects of the individual right to track and be forgotten, etc., certainly technologically create some more challenges. They're not unsolvable, but they certainly create more challenges in being able to just go across countries and aggregate data and start solving some problems.
I don't want to look like the pessimist on this, but of course data can be useful and can be quite useful. The issue is that if we are prepared, because for example in different countries, well, I think in liberal democracies, I think and if we have the right governance, we will achieve to control the access to data. Many other countries that were previously mentioned, I'm not quite certain what will be the use of that data, or for economic purposes, or for the government or the state uses of this information. And in that sense, we need to have good governance regarding the data protection issues. Because mostly, and another issue is that when we were previously discussing these issues about innovation, 2 weeks ago, we had the news that Embrel, that is used for rheumatoid arthritis, could be used for 64% of Alzheimer patients. And actually, there was a company that knew that and decided not to go further on the clinical trials. And in that sense, we know that at some point there is always an economic reason beyond all of this, and also in data.
Yeah, Natasha.
Perhaps just to pick up on this, I think one of the things that we really need to consider is how we consider digital health data more as a public good. And on the one hand, not be too constrained by sometimes imaginary barriers, which we see even in the GDPR, because the GDPR does allow us to do things within a safe and structured method, always, of course, originating from the very sort of European basis of human rights, democracy, and protection of the individual. But maybe we need to consider a little bit more also the aspect of digital health data as a public good. One of the concerns that we have in Europe at present, but globally in general, is around the incentives that have been given to pharma, and sometimes the wrong incentives that are given to pharma through the governance system. And then we complain about the costs, R&D, the broken model, etc. And I think here we are perhaps just about still in time to create the right kind of incentives that are more driven in terms of the public ethos to have the right governance and the right set of incentives in place that will encourage industry to produce what is really necessary and what will benefit health and health systems, rather than purely, as Alexandra was saying, this idea that health is a commodity, and we end up very much with the sort of Tudor Hart inverse care law issue, where the people who need it least are the ones who are being part of the quantified self movement and doing more and more to really improve their health, and who can blame them. And I'm not suggesting that we keep them back in any way, but I think we need to find ways in which we can really reach out to the people who will need and who will benefit most from the results of this data and technology being available to them.
Osman.
I'll just pick up from where Natasha was talking, when you were talking about incentives. I think the moment is really now. I know we keep saying the moment's now, but I think we can say it again, and it does apply, that both in terms of incentives, in terms of governance, as we spoke about, and also in terms of regulation. And if we can get these in place, then we can allow things to really move forward at the pace with the potential that they've got. But the other thing that I'll just play in is to say we also have another group, another stakeholder group in terms of the patient voice. I mean, some patient organizations, if you look at Eurodis in terms of rare disease, European Rare Disease Organization, it's a multi-million euro organization. It's a large organization which is doing research and doing work, and it has a view on data, and it's taking a view on data. And if you take that down to a micro level, whereas at a rare dermatology event in Milan a few days back, where this idea where, exactly as you were saying, Elias, that you get, when it's one condition in one geographical area, it feels incredibly rare. When you bring them together, the pooling of the knowledge and the pooling of the data, and you could see the real appetite to be able to make use of the data. They realize that this could unlock a huge amount, so that there's a willingness to do it. But if you can get these regulatory incentives and governance structures in place to allow it to happen in the most positive and progressive way.
Okay, I think we'll open the floor to questions, and while we figure out if there are questions and bring a microphone, I still want to ask one last question because I found it interesting earlier. You mentioned Asia and Singapore as a model where there's good governance that allows innovation. Earlier, we also talked about, before this session, you mentioned that those countries are also ones that really produce a lot of apps and sort of technological innovation at the level of patients that could help bring healthcare to a lot of people at an affordable cost. Can you reflect a little briefly on why do you think it arises from there, not from Europe?
Yeah, I think we had a good conversation before about this. I think there are some of the boundaries that we have in older continents like Europe are that we have a pre-established healthcare system, a pre-established healthcare profession, a pre-established way of doing things. And so bringing change, of course, creates a lot of other challenges that have nothing to do with the care of the patient, but that have to do with how our society and our hospitals and employment and medical profession works. And I think what you see in some of the countries in Asia is because you're starting from a background of there is no option, there is no choice, there is no, there isn't something that you're replacing. Some of these innovative approaches, especially the ones that combine, I think, technology with much lower skilled local support, right? So the idea that AI can do some of the work, a local person that maybe hasn't been educated for 20 years in the top medical school, but has good people skills and has had some training, can go a long way to triaging the easier problems and then escalating the harder ones. So you see a lot of, there's a company in China that has now deployed sort of photo booths where inside there is, and this is not science fiction, this is already installed in a lot of rural parts of China, where there is an AI doctor which is supplemented by real doctors when needed, and then the machine dispenses medicines, right? So that's an example that would take 20 years or 30 years to even conceive, to put in the streets in Europe because of all the changes that it requires culturally and professionally and so on. But where you're in a town that has nothing and where people are suffering because there is not enough doctors, there is no infrastructure, it's welcomed, right? The same in Indonesia with a lot of digital apps that are starting to work there. So I think in those countries we will see, you will have hubs like Singapore, Japan, and Korea that are very innovation friendly and big, industries and economies, but are surrounded by these countries that can benefit from their innovation in a very rapid way.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have an audience question.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator and panelists. 20 years is a long time. Rome is burning, millions are dying. We simply don't have the time. Let's be brutally frank and honest. We have spoken about a lot of things here. Governance, agility, or acrobatics, if you want to put it that way. I don't know. Ethics. I think we are skirting around the issues. And therefore, the challenge I place to you, the experts, in the face of millions of people dying in parts of the world that cannot afford anything that you're talking about. What is the single most important step that we must make in order to create a difference? What is the single most important step? Answer that question, please, if you will. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Who's going to start?
Well, I would love to earn the Nobel Prize of Peace. Well, no one knows the answer. No one knows the answer. I think the issue is that we live in an equal world, and there are some solutions for them to become more equal, or more, or at least to allow some, regarding healthcare, or mostly healthcare, there are some solutions that we need to work with. But at some point, most of the countries, and if you see in face of economic crisis, you'll see that each country is being more and more egoistic. And we see this, for example, on the refugees crisis in Europe, where you don't allow, and actually we see this movements in Europe, where you don't allow, where you don't accept. Actually, let me just say this. I have I was reading this morning in a newspaper that a country, a Portuguese guy that was in the Mediterranean in a boat helping refugees is facing 24 years of prison in Italy because he's charged of illegal immigration promotion. So in a world where someone is helping another person not to die in the Mediterranean, he's facing now 24 years of prison in Europe. So
perhaps I think one of the things that we can be a bit more honest about is that if one looks at the global burden of disease today, a large portion of that is avoidable. And if we are able to get some sense of order back at the global level, some sense of ownership and leadership over what matters, in order to tackle the industries that are pushing people into avoidable deaths, we could release a lot of money for those rare kiddies with expensive gene therapies. But that's not something that we can do alone in the room. It requires the people to push the governments to want to do it. And perhaps over there, we can be a bit better in trying to reach out to people and making them more aware and more literate and more angry and passionate about the changes that need to be brought into place. Not angry in the wrong way by electing the wrong leaders, but angry in the right way by pushing in the right direction. But I think that's going a bit broad.
let me just a little bit. Anyway, we are being quite pessimistic. But anyway, the health, it's better and it's getting better and it was much worse than 10 years ago. These issues about. So I think also we need to well, not to be happy with it, but things are getting better. And I think SDGs and the commitments that are being in place worldwide, even though they are not sufficient, they are going in the right track.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on something similar as well. I think, you asked for one thing, and I think we should also celebrate our successes, right? So we live in a world whose life expectancy has improved, across the board. We have actually tackled a lot of challenges in the last generations, and we need to celebrate those successes and scale them and talk about them, invest in them, and make them more and more available. One of the things, and I'm certainly an indefatigable optimist, so I will take that glass half full approach, but one of the things that I think is really giving hope is if I look at the majority of projects in a place like Boston at MIT, and if I look especially at the 20-year-old generation, all the people that are finishing their degrees, doing their PhDs and postdocs right now, first of all, they're truly global citizens. A lot of their projects are with a look to the global world and not to one country or another. And so much of the passion and investment of these people is always looking at some of the issues that I tried to raise. So for example, I don't know, the small devices lab at MIT is all about, can you test and build, an asthma respiratory device that is cheap, simple, can be done with DIY in every country for under $1 or $2, and there's thousands of these projects, right? So what gives me optimism is, A, we actually have tackled some challenges, and we just don't, I think, do a good enough job of really investing in them, talking about them. But also, if I look at what let's say, the geeks of 20 years ago were building apps and so on, the smart kids of today are actually really focusing a lot and very concerned, and I think they will be the ones who will show us, how to improve this place. It's not, the people of another age, it's their generation.
So we are not responsible, the young ones are.
I mean, we should be provoked with these questions. We need to be provoked with these questions. I'd concur in terms of being able to reflect. I don't think healthcare is always that good at being able to acknowledge when it has made progress, as well as not always being that good at being able to see what future challenges there are. But one thing I would do is recognize the fact that if we are going to make further progress within an increasingly complex world and an increasingly complex health systems, just teach health literacy to children for 1 hour a week. We cannot expect all of us generationally to be able to deal with the issues that we've got and to make best benefit of the options we've got until we have higher levels of health literacy. So that would be my one thing.
Thank you. I think we're running over time, so we'll have to finish here. Just a brief note that this is lunchtime, but there will be several sessions during the lunch break, and you're welcome to go and get your lunch and eat during those sessions. So in this room, there will be EHMA Annual General Assembly, which is for EHMA members, so you're welcome to eat while you're here. There will be a roundtable on mentorship, leadership, and management in Klondike Room, and poster pitches will be happening in the exhibition area. So if you want to pitch your poster in personalization track, integration track, or value-based healthcare track, come and see me at the exhibition area. Thank you, everyone.